What up?
What up?
Yeah.
How's it going?
It's going. Are you talking to me or are you talking to them?
Just generally.
Okay.
Just, it's something we say.
Let us know in the comments how you guys are doing. How's it going? Where are you at?
It's something we say.
Give us your location.
How you doing? Doing good. Thanks for asking.
I'm tired. My back hurts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I try not to say I'm good anymore.
Really?
To that question, yeah.
Okay.
Try
Why?
to give healthy honesty in the appropriate context.
Jeez.
Because I'm good, I don't think is always honest.
No, it's certainly not, but...
Thanks for your vulnerability.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Hey, I got a question though.
Uh-oh.
If you could talk in any accent, what type of accent would you have?
Scottish for sure. 1,000%. I love it.
And
I want it.
I know I've heard you explain this before. What makes something Scottish?
I've explained this before. We've had this conversation.
Well, we've had this conversation before.
I don't remember
knew
this.
if someone would have asked me what is Ben's
Dang,
favorite accent,
okay.
I would have 100% known it was Scottish.
I guess I don't understand the question of what makes something Scottish.
Okay, so you got Scottish, you've got English, you've got
It's
Irish.
It's the accent. It's the dialect.
Yeah, but like,
and the way in which
what's the distinction?
You're trying to make me say it. Or
I don't know if I
talk
am,
in
but
it.
I don't.
What is the difference between you can't even tell the difference between like Irish and Scottish?
With my eyes closed, probably not.
Oh, I bet you could.
What would I look for?
It's just you just know.
Okay, well.
Listen, you just know it when you see it, or in this case, hear it.
Hear it. Okay, all right, sure.
It's a great question that I don't know how to answer, but for some reason, when I hear the Scottish accent, to the point of like 10 years ago when me and Abby were talking through, like, are we ever going to adopt kids? I said, yeah, if it can be a Scottish redheaded, this is aggressive and weird, Scottish redheaded female that is old enough to where she will keep the Scottish accent when she becomes our child. It's really weird. It's I have this obsession with the accent. It's awesome.
Are Scots? Is it Scots?
Scots.
Short?
Yeah, sure. It's probably derogatory, but I don't know.
No, I'm so sorry, people from Scotland. Are they the kilt people?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, dude, yeah, absolutely.
I just get them all mixed up over there.
Yeah, they are the kilt people.
The kilt people. They didn't kilt people, but they wear the kilt.
They did not.
They are people.
What's the Disney movie with the redhead?
Brave.
Scottish.
Brave.
That's Scottish.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm framing it.
It's awesome.
Piece
It's
by piece.
fantastic.
Emily, what would you say?
Okay, I actually really want to learn how to talk like a New Yorker. Like, I just feel like I'm not very aggressive, and I don't know. I just feel like sometimes I need to be more assertive in my life, and I think I do that really well as a New Yorker.
Are you walking here?
Huh?
That's what I'm walking here.
So good.
That's it.
But I've been watching Worst Cooks in America, and one of the chefs, yeah, it's been bad.
What a show.
One of the chefs actually talks like a New Yorker and yells at everybody like a New Yorker, and I'm like, I think I need to adopt
from
that.
New York?
I don't know.
So are they just talking like themselves?
Maybe.
That's good. I don't know if I can do an accent, but I love it when Spanish people roll their R's.
So good.
That's nice.
It's so nice.
I would love to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Just that. I don't even need to speak the whole language. Just if in my English I rolled my R's like they roll their R's, I would take that.
That's a good one.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's super good.
Be good.
Do it for a whole sermon.
Be tough.
When I go back to North Dakota and visit family, I get the upper Minnesota, North Dakota accent.
Huh.
I'll come home with it for a couple days. Yeah.
Crazy.
But yeah, we're talking about voices, and I think what's really interesting about a voice is that it can shape a reality. It's incredibly powerful, and we started this season with an episode on the voice of God, and God's voice is truth. But I think that one of the incredibly powerful voices that we experience is the voice of shame. And I think even as we were prepping for this podcast, we define shame as both an experience and a feeling, and it's believing that we're flawed and unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. And that definition comes from a psychologist named Brene Brown. But how do we see shame just kind of playing out in our culture?
Yeah, I like how even the distinction, we use the word voice, but voice doesn't mean audible.
Yep. Not tongue.
Yeah, it's not tongue, So when we talk about the voice of God, very, 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 very rarely is that the audible voice of God. It's the impression of God upon our life that moves us in a direction. So through his word, through his community, through his spirit. So it's very similar when we're talking about the voice of shame. We're not talking about necessarily the things people have spoken over you, though that could be a part of it. It is the feelings and emotions and impressions of the world and sometimes the enemy, sometimes our own self that push us in a direction of unhealth and difficulty in a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's good.
I think too, like it becomes a narrative. Like it shapes our reality, becomes a story that we tell ourselves over and over again, even if it didn't actually happen that way. And like, so you can have an experience where like maybe you like make a mistake, but it turns into, instead of I made a mistake, it turns into I am a mistake.
I think
I am a failure.
Yeah.
I think that is the distinction. Go ahead.
It's the bedrock of shame.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's I either have made a mistake and recently or a long time ago, and shame turns that to then I am that mistake. I am the thing in which I failed at, which ultimately what shame does is hijacks Jesus' story for us of either redemption of the thing maybe I've done wrong or keeps us in the lie of living not in truth, not in what Jesus wants us to live in.
You know, we've
so aggressive.
We've dialogued on this a couple of times in the last month, but it's identity language. Shame goes at your sense of identity. Who are you? Not what have you done, what mistake. Who are you?
Yep.
And there's even this conversation I've had with a handful of people lately where I just see how so important we need to guard the terms we use to self-identify. And some of it is like, I hear people say, well, I'm an idiot. And they like jokingly say that. And it's like, no, you made a mistake. You're not an idiot. Or like, things like that where we jokingly talk about ourselves. And I've even pushed back against, and I feel like Ben's going to have a thought here, but the language we sometimes use in church that I'm a sinner.
Oh, I agree.
I went into this biblical deep dive when I first started thinking about this. And in the New Testament, there are 2, maybe 3 times where the word sinner is used to categorize the group of believers. And every single time it's talking about a past reality, not a present thing we're living in. And so even shame here, if shame says, we start to tell ourselves and live in this narrative that I'm a sinner, and most people do it from a humble disposition. They want to embrace this idea that I'm not perfect, I am flawed, and I need the grace of Jesus. And I understand that. But you're feeding yourself a narrative that frames your future progress in Jesus. And so if you continuously tell yourself you're a sinner, if you continuously live in a shame, even something like that feels biblically adjacent, it shapes you. It pushes you in a direction. So I would rather say I'm a saint, I'm redeemed, I'm a new creation who struggles with sin. One's a mistake, one's an action I make, one's an identity I live in.
That I've been called.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I 1,000% agree.
So then it's just like, I think there's even stuff like that. We think shame is like, oh, I can't even be worthy. But shame is any identity that leads us away from what is God's calling on our life.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
But that also hits on how God created us. God, like, to be human is not to be broken. To be human is not to be sinful. To be human is to be designed in God's image. Yeah. And sin, like, we encounter brokenness, but that doesn't mean that God created us for that. God created us for something more.
It's good.
But I think, too, like, it hits on the fact that shame is a narrative that everybody experiences. I think Brene Brown, the psychologist, has done some research. She says that for women, we experience the narrative of shame as we need to do everything and we need to be doing it perfectly. And then even inside of that list of we need to be doing everything, then it's like the conflicting messages, all right, so what actually is everything? Like, and then like, then you have like, you should be doing this and this and this and this, and it's very competing. She mentioned that for men, it's the message that you shouldn't be weak. And I'm not a man. And so I kind of just want to ask, like, do you agree with that? Like, would you add anything to that, take anything away from it?
I think that's not the one when I think of shame for myself and what I've experienced the last almost 20 years being a Jesus follower, the biggest lie when it came to shame about myself was I was unworthy of love. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't like I'm okay. And I don't know if this is just because I've followed Jesus. It was based off of sin. Mm-hmm. I became and was the mistakes that I had made in my life, and therefore couldn't ever actually be, whether human relationally or in relationship with God, actually be in relationship with people because I felt unworthy of love. Like, that's the biggest shame I've walked in personally.
I think some of this comes into gender norms and stereotypes today are a lot more blended than they've probably ever been. And in the midst of that, there is some stuff that's really kind of dangerous about that, and there's some stuff that's probably really good, really honest about that. And some of this, like, I'm not going to say that's wrong. Like, that's what her research
for sure.
Do I think it aligns with what I feel? No.
Yeah, same.
I like, honestly,
but I know men who have perceived that is
1,000%.
Yes.
John Eldredge wrote a book called Wild at Heart that became a New York Times bestseller and is on that has existed. It's probably found its way into every church bookshelf like ever. And he did it on this principle that men often feel weak. Like, it's real. People feel that. Do I feel that? No. I feel more, honestly, the woman one. I feel more the pressure to be perfect and to do it all than I do the sense that I'm weak. You know, so it's like, even there, it's like, does that make me a female? Does that make no? Very clearly for everybody listening or watching, no. But that's what I feel. Yeah. And so I don't fit into the category, but shame, it affects us all.
Yeah, so it's more like our society, like, gender roles are just very diverse just because of how our society has progressed. And so, like, it's not like black and white, but you can experience messages across, like, the entire spectrum of being a man or a woman.
Yep.
But I think what's interesting to me about shame is that it's not just like this feeling or experience, but it actually is part of our physiology. So actually this feeling gets displayed in how we act within our own bodies. And so when we think about, like, when you encounter like a dangerous situation, we use the language of flight, fight, or freeze. It's kind of like, what do you do if, you know, you're about to get mugged? Do you fight the person? Do you just like freeze and collapse, or do you just like run away?
When you've been in fights before, what is your answer? I need to know the answer to this question.
Are you a fight, flight, or freezer?
I tell myself I'm a fighter, but we all know I'm a freezer.
Well, if you got to use your legs, I think you'd be okay. I feel like you said that at one point. I think maybe not. Yeah, aren't you a kicker?
Yeah. Or I just run. That's why I keep running, you know, just in case.
I'm a fighter.
I don't know, man. I feel
for
like,
sure. Because it's not
in
shame.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah,
it's in all the things in which there is anxiety, worry, fears, like those, right? Fight. Usually in defensiveness, actually.
And in this, like, if you're trying to process it, really, shame is a belief system. Yeah. And any belief system impacts the totality of how we live our life.
Yep.
That's why we talk about faith. Aaron preached just this
so good
epic message the other Sunday about James 2, faith and actions, the collaboration of the two, the outflowing and inflowing of how those two work together. But it's the fundamental way that God has wired us as people. If you have a belief about who you are going to live that belief out. Yep. And so shame is like, oh, if I have this act of shame, like one of these three things is showing up in your life. Yep. Like, it's just the way we're hardwired. And sometimes it works great, and sometimes the hardwiring gets a little janky, but this is happening.
Yep.
Yeah, so let's dive deeper into this. So, like, if you're a flighter, if you're someone that runs away, usually this looks like a feeling to hide and disappear. And what's interesting about how God has wired us is that we physically do this. And so, like, your shoulders will become compressed, like your back is hunched over. You physically try to take up less space so that way you can leave a situation. Which I just think is fascinating. The next two, fighting, this is like a verbal or behavioral aggression towards someone else. Freezing is just like not even, maybe you physically leave a situation, but like mentally and emotionally you're stuck there, and you're stuck in that belief system, you're stuck in that narrative, and you're constantly just seeing everything as in the position of being powerless and just as something is wrong with you. And I think what is remarkable to me about shame is that it doesn't go away on its own. It has to be dealt with. It has to be processed. And if it's not processed or dealt with in a redeeming way and with the gospel, it's physically detrimental to our health.
What a great distinction between the physical proximity to like emotional and like relational even health of that. And the way I think about shame is if we don't deal with it, we shove it down under. And sometimes when you shove something under the surface, all it does is embed it deeper into your system of belief.
Yes.
If you don't process it or deal with it and you put it aside, it doesn't disappear. It continues to corrode from the inside. Like, it's like you're impressing it deeper into your system of belief by not processing it.
That's good.
Whether it's fight, flight, or freeze, like that shoves it deeper into who you are. And so you have to find a way in order to get that out of you and to replace it with something that's truer.
That's good.
And it thrives in the dark. Like it grows. Like shame is just something that thrives off of isolation. It thrives off of that feeling of being alone. But I think too that we see that God is just very active in offering us a new narrative. And in Genesis chapter 3, we see for the first time that humans experience shame. Adam and Eve were in the garden. They're living it up. They're working with God. They're partnering with him. And then they are tempted. They sin. They eat the apple. And they realize that they're naked. And they hear God coming. And so they go hide.
Immediate response.
I mean, how insightful or eye-opening, I maybe should say, that the first response to sin entering the world is shame. Like, what should that tell us about the way shame is still
embedded?
Yeah, just corrosive over
Yes.
the entire creation that God has made. Like the very first, like,
Yeah.
yes, you can argue why did they eat the fruit? You can get into reason and motive and like, but the response, the first like inklings of sin on the shame.
Yeah. Yep. And no, it's like, yeah, that's so good because, and why that's important to know how sin and shame are connected is shame forces us to focus on action and not identity, which is why identity is important because immediately they forgot after they were created, God called them good and we're still good. And even in the midst of sin, they were still good, yet not what they believed was failure, wrong. Like I'm naked now, not good. I'm barren and alone, not good. Yeah. It's crazy how it works. Yeah.
And I think too, like even the way the sin happened was also an identity crisis.
Yeah.
Like they were charged to extend God's authority. And so when the serpent tempts them, it's going against how they're created. Yeah. And then because they hide, they're still living in a way that they're not designed to live. They're still living in brokenness. And then, but we see that God still comes. Like shame doesn't keep God away. Like God approaches us in our shame. Good. And he's like actively searching for them when they're hiding and he's calling out to them.
So good.
And I think like that's so powerful for us because God is actively calling out to each and every one of us, even when like we're feeling isolated and feeling stuck in these narratives.
And why we feel isolated, especially when it comes to God, is that what shame does is it builds fear within us that not only do I believe I am the thing that I've done wrong, it's I believe that person or God also believes that about me. So I'm going to go hide and I'm going to isolate and I'm not going to want to. And yet in God's goodness, he chases and he finds. That's so good. I'm like,
and I think too, like it hits off like even like one of your narratives of feeling unworthy, like unworthy to like receive forgiveness, unworthy to even just like
be in the presence of.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Well, and even if we keep going, so Peter's another great example.
Yeah.
Peter is Jesus' right-hand man. He seemingly is the leader of the disciples, then apostles. He is the guy with the answers. He has this unbelievable failure, like just botches everything when it mattered. And he finds himself at Jesus' trial, essentially, warming himself by the fire, denies Jesus, and then you see he leaves the temple area or the synagogue area, and he's weeping in shame because he knows that he has just rejected the one who offered him life. Like he is just filled with shame. And yet Jesus, when he comes back after his resurrection, seeks out Peter.
Yeah.
Peter's back on the boat, doing the same thing he did before he met Jesus. He's back in the place, going back to routine life. Probably we can make maybe assumptions that he'd given up on himself, given up on the kingdom, given up on he's filled with shame. He's on the boat, but his life is different than it ever. And Jesus from the edges of the water just calls out, Peter, come to me. Hey, can I have some of your fish? Peter throws off the cloak, like almost a physical reminder. He takes off his outer garments and dives into the water, removing some of the shame, swimming to Jesus. Jesus, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And the reinstation of Peter starts with the pursuit of Jesus. Peter did nothing to deserve Jesus' continual pursuit. Yet Jesus, do you love me? Peter, of course I love you. He says, okay, feed my sheep. And he reinstates him, gives him purpose, gives him identity again. So good.
So good.
And even the repetition of the three, like Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and 3 times Jesus asks him and instructs him like how to build the kingdom. Yeah. And there's just like this sense of like wholeness and completeness in that Jesus like fully covers all of that.
Yeah.
I think of, this might be off. You guys might have to say if this is stupid. Like Zechariah and Elizabeth. And so here's why. There is and was at least in Jewish culture, a narrative that if you were childless, there was a sense of shame because God's judgment was on you. And so you lived in cultural shame with a sense of shame if you were childless because there was this assumption that God was judging you. Like you were, something about your relationship with God, something about the way you're living was off. Yeah. And so you had Elizabeth and Zechariah who were in seclusion. And we know they were in seclusion because even when they found out they were pregnant, in Luke 1 at the very end, I don't know why this came to my head. In Luke 1, it says after they found out they were pregnant, Elizabeth remained in seclusion until after 5 months. And so it's remained so secluded because of this sense of shame. Waited even after hearing the good news and the truth for 5 months, because what happens around 5 months usually you can see. Like there is this sense, and so then was able to, out of a sense of, no, God is actually, like, we're not receiving the judgment of God, was able to then live in freedom of, like, God is with us, whatever, all this stuff. But just like how shame can force us to live in such fear and seclusion in that way. And yet, even in the promise of God, there's still well, but what if? I see that in Elizabeth, and yet, okay, then 5 months, belly starting to show, I can now live not in seclusion because, hey, the truth of which God has said is coming to fruition. Yeah. And sometimes it takes time in the midst of shame to actually start believing the truth too. We'll get to that, I know, but I just had to, like, there's something about how shame works in seclusion, and yet how God is continually running after, chasing, going towards us, chasing out. Like it's Jesus with Peter. It's God in the garden. Just don't ever forget that reality. Even in the midst of you experiencing shame, God is in the midst with you, present, chasing you.
Yeah. Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
In one of the difficult parts of imagery in the church is we don't know exactly what it looked like. There were no photographers there. Yet in most depictions, Jesus wears some kind of covering on when he hangs on the cross.
Dude.
But biblically we know he didn't wear a covering. And so you see Adam and Eve in the garden when they are naked. They were naked and unashamed. Sin enters the world. They are now naked and ashamed. And Jesus hangs on the cross naked and unashamed again. Yeah. And there's something about, even in that, he is there's not a more vulnerable state to be in than to be naked.
Yeah.
There isn't.
Yep.
And we could dive into how sexual sin or sexual exploration is so deeply linked to shame, because I believe the way Paul talks about it in Corinthians, that it is a sin that happens within our own body that is just different, and how God is trying to heal the deepest wounds of our shame through our own nakedness, through our own broken. Like he hung on the cross naked as people. Like it wasn't they weren't like out in the countryside. No. The skull of Golgotha was probably right alongside the path that led into Jerusalem, that hundreds, thousands of people walked past him that day and saw him hanging there naked, bleeding, beaten, rejected, just like, talk about shame.
Yeah. And bore it.
Yeah, and bore it, took it.
Yeah.
Scorning, Hebrews just says, scorning the shame, and then earned the victory to sit at the right hand of the Father. And now look at him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you won't grow weary and lose heart. Yeah. Like some of that is when we see Jesus walk through shame as our high priest who intercedes for us. He knows shame. There's not an ounce of shame you feel that Jesus has not experienced.
Yeah, that's good.
Like if you feel it, if you believe it, he's felt it. And as your high priest, he can empathize with you and he petitions for you. Like,
it's good.
I had a mentor who would talk about the crucifixion of Jesus a lot, and just like as we talked about shame a little bit, and she would reference this book that talked about how, like, when Jesus dies, right, like he takes sin and shame, all of that to the grave. Yeah. But when Jesus walked out of that tomb, when that tomb was empty, that, like, sin and shame wasn't there. Like sin and shame was like left where Jesus defeated it. And Jesus walked out and he didn't take that with him. So when we look at the fact that we were crucified with Christ and we no longer live, like the sin and the shame, like we get to count, like we're dead to that and we get to live in Christ. And so I think part of listening to the voice of shame is giving power to a voice that's already been defeated.
That's so good. That's so, because why won't they remember Jesus naked on the cross? Because the power of God to forgive, redeem, and restore is a greater moment than what was taken and what was borne, shame on the cross. It's like, I'm not going to remember Jesus naked on the cross because what I'm going to, he died. Yeah. And now he's not dead. That is so good. Yeah. Holy crap. Sorry, that just like flipped. That was phenomenal.
But maybe let's move a little bit more practical here.
I guess.
So Rich Viotis is a pastor in New York. But
Emily told me to do that at one point in the podcast.
Yeah, for anybody not watching but listening, Ben just like completely closed Brennan's notes.
I don't need him.
He doesn't.
But Rich Viotis, I think, has a really good process for the questions we can ask to see what narrative we're asking ourselves and what narrative we're telling ourselves. The questions are, what happened? What am I feeling? What is the story I'm telling myself? What does the gospel say? And what counter-instinctual action is needed? And I really appreciate this process because as someone who is not always in touch with what they feel, it allows me to be objective. It allows me to sit down and say, what am I actually telling myself? And how is that actually not the right message I should be telling myself?
Yep.
I'll start with just the fact that this is a process.
Yeah.
And most of us don't spend any time processing.
Reflecting and actually processing. Yep.
And I understand it. I've been there myself, but we have to do this because it's just so easy to get tools, but never put tools into action.
Yep.
And this will help you.
Absolutely.
It will. If you do this, it will help you. You have to take the time to sit with a journal, with a notebook, with a friend, and ask these questions in process. Like for me, it looks like almost daily, probably 4 times a week at least. I have to look back over my last 24 hours and ask, what happened?
Yep.
How did I feel about that? Is there a narrative I'm filling in that's not true? How would Jesus step in and fix or work in the midst of this? And then what do I do because of it? Like I have to do that 4 times a week at minimum.
Yep.
And if I don't, I can feel the heaviness of it's like I'm clogged up on the inside. And God's trying to speak to me. He's trying to lead me. He's trying to show me the way, but I am not processing the things that he's leading.
Yep.
We have to make the time for it.
And I think that hits on the next thing too of like Jesus invites us to walk in freedom, but freedom isn't just something like, we achieve at one time and we're good for the rest of our life. It's a continual learning process of how do I understand this narrative, but also how do I keep living into what God has desired of me.
Yep. So good.
And I think the next thing too is vulnerability. Brene Brown says that vulnerability and empathy are like the antidote to shame. I think that's maybe a piece of it. I think part of it is vulnerability with God. And I think there's 2 things we need to allow God to see. The first one is the open wounds that we're covering with Band-Aids. We need to bring those to him. But the second one is the wounds that have been calloused over because we won't let him in. And part of vulnerability is allowing God to scrape off the calluses so that way he can actually heal the wound that's underneath.
Yeah. It's a self-awareness, self-discovery that you're allowing the Lord to speak into, which takes time. Yeah, that's good.
The example I think of in vulnerability, and this it's weird, but it sticks with me. I'm pretty sure it's Pete Scazzaro.
Okay.
He talks about like redeeming shame in sexuality and how him and his wife spend naked time together.
Oh yeah.
Do you know?
Yep. Yeah.
And I heard that idea for the first time and I was like, that is so like, I'm
just
not talking,
staring at each other.
Just staring
That's
at
it.
each
No
other.
talking. Yep. I'm sure this is really comfortable for Emily.
But it'll stick with you because
will.
it is so jarring.
Yep.
That he said one of the ways they overcame shame about their bodies, about their sexuality, and in their marriage was they spent time like Adam and Eve being naked together. And I just sat there and I was like, bro, that's weird.
Yeah.
But that's vulnerable.
Yep.
And that's honest and it's real. And the only reason I think it's weird is because there's shame there.
Yeah. Yep.
And then as you begin to take off shame, and this only should exist within the context of marriage. This is just an example I'm using to help highlight vulnerability.
Yeah.
But like that's what vulnerability is to take off the coverings and let people see us how we actually are.
Yeah.
And when they see us how we actually are, the shame starts to melt away.
Yep.
And I think it hits on it too. Like it's an aspect of allowing God to see us, but also our community to see us.
Yeah.
And I think we have to discern who we allow to speak into those areas. But I think that's the gift of Christian community is that sometimes they are speaking the voice and the words of God into areas of our life that need it.
Yeah, because they are the only ones sometimes who can actually speak the truth that we're not able to see because shame is so embedded in our life.
It's blinding us.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing too is that because we define shame as both feeling and experiences, that some of our experiences, like we actually need help in processing them. Like I meet with a counselor, I have for a while, because there are things in my life where I need help in like figuring out what do I tell myself, what actually happened, how am I now walking in freedom practically, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Super good.
All right. That one's heavy, but that's
good. That was good.
That's good.
That was good stuff.
I'm going to listen to that one back.
I think you guys should post that. Rich Viona's process.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Super good.
We'll see you guys later.
See ya.
Goodbye.